Get a little message when it starts.
Yeah, see on the top.
There we go. Okay. It's the subcommittee one call to order, and welcome everybody here. It's 1:35. And defer now to approval of minutes.
Yes, I have the minutes. They were attached to the agenda through a hyperlink. So there are any corrections that need to be made. I did make one correction. It's on the sentence. It's approval of the minutes from October the 13th, not
October 21st.
Yeah, it should not be. Yeah, it should be from September the 30th, not from October 21st. So
in paragraph 2.
And yes, so I just need to have that correction. So I've already noted that, and that will be changed.
You have a motion to accept the minutes?
Move to approve with the correction that was made.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. Brian, you're on the hook now.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone enjoyed their lunch after this morning's Subcommittee 2 meeting. So we're going, let me see, did I share my screen? Not yet.
It was a tough meeting, by the way.
Making good progress here. So today we're going to continue the discussion on Subcommittee 1, which entails Task 3 goal setting, as well as discussions on the minimum standards or recommendations. So we're going to review the changes that were made to the draft goals from last meeting. We're going to look at some potential additions to those goals, and also reevaluate the discussion on the minimum standards in light of our conversation from last time, potentially recommending standards rather than adopting them. And we'll also look in more detail at the stakeholder survey, as well as some open discussion and feedback. I did include a few new slides that are just contextual, so they're not decision based, or don't hinge on any of our decisions today, but based on some of our questions from last subcommittee meeting, wanted to provide some feedback and clarification on those. So I'll point out the new slides when we get to them, and we'll send out an updated slideshow after the meeting. So to review again the roadmap, we scheduled another meeting for next Thursday, which is really just to be on the safe side in case we don't cover everything that we'd like to today. Hopefully we can get most of it done, but we just given our deadline for posting to the public all of the goals, we wanted to, that's going to be posted by November 15th or the morning of the 16th. So to have all of the things we need to do discussed, we scheduled a next meeting for next Thursday just in case. And again, the recommendations that will be posted will be adopted by the RFPG on our November 30th meeting. Okay, so I included again a map of the region, including the different HUC-8 boundaries, just again for reference, because the goals can be defined at a HUC-8 level. A lot of our goals so far have been region-wide focused, and so the next several slides are just a rehash of the slides or the goals that we discussed last time. So just I won't talk through each of the goals in particular, but I wanted to just point out the changes that we made based on our discussion. So we updated the wording for several of the goals, such as the improving CRS rating for communities that currently participate, and we also changed the levies goal to a region-wide, whereas before it was just focused on El Paso. We also expanded the scope of the flood warning system goal based on Omar's comment from our last subcommittee meeting that that events like in Marfa could be mitigated. The hazards could be notified to the public and help prevent injury or loss of life or other damages. So we changed that to a region-wide goal, and we also changed the Nfip participation goal slightly to where the short-term goal will be focusing on an intermediate target of maybe 85 to 90%, and the long-term target will be the 100% participation. We also consolidated a few goals or removed a couple goals, which we'll explain. Dave pointed out to me before this meeting that we're missing some goal numbers. So in the slide it goes from goal 7 to 9. That's an error. We'll have that corrected by the next meeting, but we did consolidate a couple goals into to focus on a short-term goal, such as this increasing communities who have adopted higher than Nfip minimum standards. Since there are so few communities in the region that do have these standards, we wanted to, rather than focus too long-term, we wanted to focus based on our conversation last week, or last meeting, wanted to focus more on the short-term goals and just in terms of increasing the number of communities rather than setting a specific percentage. And then the same type of idea with respect to the number of communities enrolled in the CRS program. Since currently City of El Paso is the only participant in that, we didn't want to set a specific percentage at this time based on our discussion from last time. So all the remaining goals are still pretty much left unchanged. So I guess before we move forward, I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to provide any additional feedback on those goals as drafted so far.
On to the yellow highlights and give you some numbers to fill there.
Yes, thanks, Dave. So these numbers will be defined by our next subcommittee meeting next week. And so we'll also maybe put that to a vote in certain cases to see how the subcommittee members feel about specific targets. But the focus of today will be to complete our list of goals, and then next week we'll define the specific criteria that we'll be using to evaluate or measure those goals.
So based on what you said earlier, if we don't need next week, we have time today, we can go back through these and put the numbers in?
Yeah, if we have the time today, we can do that as well.
Okay.
Okay, so if no other comments, one of the topics that came up in our last subcommittee meeting was the question on nature-based solutions and what are some examples. This is pertaining to the goal number 4, which is considering incorporating nature-based practices and flood reduction projects throughout the region. So nature-based solutions do have different definitions depending on the source. They're often very similar and are centered on focusing or solutions that are motivated and supported by nature. They have multiple benefits: environmental, economic, and social. They're meant to improve resiliency of the community and ultimately use the flood risk reduction benefits of natural systems, including wetlands or other features that already serve a benefit and can be utilized in addition to constructed solutions. So I posted a link here to a much more in-depth guidebook that was developed by AECOM actually for the Nature Conservancy. In that guidebook, there's some examples of different nature-based solutions. I picked some of the solutions that would be more applicable to our region. Nature-based solutions are very common, and there's many other options to consider on the coast for coastal resiliency. So I've removed those, but in this list we're focusing on a lot of these are familiar concepts, but they all fall under the idea of a nature-based solution. So they could include riparian buffers, offsetting development, intentionally to set aside a floodplain area, using that area in for multiple purposes, including parks or greenways. It may include low-impact development, which would utilize native vegetation and help to store excess or initial runoff. Can also improve water quality. And then in terms of floodplain restoration, a lot of times development can negatively impact the floodplain, and so engaging in restoration activities can fall under that, as well as land conservation, and at the neighborhood level, things like green roofs, green streets, permeable pavers, swales, different green infrastructure also falls under that category. These are linked to specific sites from the nature the nrcsolutions.org website. So you might find some more information here if you're interested on the specific types of solutions that could fall under that category. Are there any other questions on those slides?
I just had a quick comment that
yeah.
the Army Corps of Engineers also is apparently, just from conversations at a recent conference, they're leaning more toward the nature-based solutions, whereas in the past they've always kind of gone more with a hard engineering solutions with concrete channels and getting water out of there as quickly as possible. But it seems like they have a newer initiative for resilience with nature, and so they do have some recent documents that were just published in 2021 that also talk about nature-based solutions. So we have those, and I can post a link to those in the chat here in a minute. I think Lily, you found where those were online, right? Are you able to post a link to those?
Yes, I will.
Thanks.
But you told me, Chris, they weren't dealing specifically with arid climates, right? You told me they were basically nationwide guidelines.
Yeah, there are a lot of coastal solutions, but it kind of covers the gamut. So it's just another resource I wanted to bring up, and just to mention that the Corps is kind of moving in this direction as well. But there is more of a coastal focus. Yeah, that is true.
Right. Okay, thanks, Chris. All right, so moving on to potential additions to goals. We will we sent out in the agenda. There's also a link to a Region 15 goal list, and we will look at that in shortly to compare with our current set of goals. But I wanted to first just give an overview of what goals we've added and how the individual communities may fall into these goals. So In our stakeholder survey, we asked specific communities if they would like to include their own community-specific goals in the flood plan. These are some of the responses that we received. Several counties replied as that were interested in either developing flood mitigation plans or reducing flood risk, maintaining continuous investment in flood control infrastructure, or acquiring property within the floodplain. So these are just some of the individual interests within the region. And I think the approach we were going to recommend is for the subcommittee, once the subcommittee has made its recommendations and those goals are posted publicly, we will be coordinating with each of these individual stakeholders and see if the current draft goals are sufficient for what, for the directions that they would like to go, and if they would like to add or make any comments during that period, the public comment period, that would be an appropriate time for them to introduce their specific community focus goals. So we are going to be working with each of these communities and just talking with them to see what they're interested in. But today we're still focused on the region, for region-wide goals. So there are 6 new goals that we've added, and several of these came from our discussion from last week, as well as from examples from other regions. We created an outline of some of the goals that were discussed from Region 15, which is the Lower Rio Grande region, and some of their goals may be also applicable to our region. So we have goals on increasing flood gauges, goals on number of entities using flood warning signs and message boards, increasing entities that have dedicated drainage fees to help implement future studies or projects, and developing and maintaining community operational stormwater asset management plans. We also have 2 other potential goals: decreasing the number of communities without a local funding source, to encourage communities to utilize their own local funding where possible, and also as a last goal, to increase the number of other funding sources that may be used for implementation. And these could be measured based on community responses through the future cycle surveys. We will go back to these again in a little bit, but I wanted to get through we have some discussion items that may help as we talk through everything. So we'll skip this. I wanted to address some of the questions that came up from our last subcommittee meeting, where we were in relationship to the conversation on the minimum standards. We asked about what's the length of time a community would take to enroll in the Nfip. So for this question, we didn't find any people with specific experience in enrolling in the Nfip. However, based on the outline presented from FEMA and the Texas Water Development Board for the process, we came up with a kind of a rough estimate for that timeline. First, there might be a process, an initial process where the community officials would discuss flood risk and insurance needs and make that decision. That could be maybe a month timeline. After that, there would be a need to identify the level of regulation and the sample regulations and make adjustments to that. So that could take another 6 to 8 weeks to do that. Then lastly, as the community is developing the their own regulations. They would need to review and modify their regulations to fit their own needs, including any higher standards. They're not able to remove text from the sample regulations, but they would be adding to it. And then they would need to verify through their legal staff that they have the ability to enforce those regulations and what those procedures would look like. So that will take a large portion of their effort in terms of developing the goal and developing the regulations. And then once those are finally developed, it could be 3 to 4 months just to get from the starting point to here, and then it would be another month potentially to adopt the regulations as a city or county resolution. Then submitting to FEMA could take 2 to 3 months. So with all these checkpoints considered, we're estimating it could take between 6 to 8 months for a community to enroll in the Nfip if they decided today that that's something that they would want to do. Because with that in mind, kind of to continue the discussion from our last subcommittee meeting, whereas other regions had decided to, based on the accelerated schedule of this current first cycle flood plan, they did not want to adopt any minimum standards, but rather opted to make recommendations on standards and have those standards be considered for the future adoption. That could be an approach that we take as a region, and so just that discussion is. It may be helpful to keep this timeline in mind when we're talking about that, because it is true that if the region were to adopt standards right now, such as requiring communities to participate in the Nfip, for those communities that do not currently participate, there would be a 6 to 8 month potential window of time for them to make that happen, which would be beyond the timeline of our first cycle plan. So it could potentially be restrictive at this stage. Another question came up regarding suspension, Nfip probation and suspension process. So I've included some links here. There's a list of participating, non-participating communities on FEMA website. If the community does not enforce floodplain management ordinances that meet Nfip minimum requirements, that's what would potentially trigger probation or suspension. So first, if a community is identified through inspection of their processes or development, like for example, let's say they during an inspection, it's found that there's development in a floodplain that was not permitted or reviewed for flood-prone, from a flood risk standpoint, that could trigger conversation with FEMA, in which FEMA would provide assistance to the community to help it become compliant. If that's not possible through that discussion, the community can be placed on probation or suspended, and there would be a written notice of those specific deficiencies in a 90-day window for resolution. The difference between probation and suspension is that probation would be temporary and does not affect availability of flood insurance, while suspension would be more permanent in terms of the community would be removed from the participation list, and it would affect the community's availability of flood insurance for the community. So those are the different levels. And when we looked back at the two, there are two communities in our region actually that do have a suspended status. This is the community status book report from FEMA. And at the very end, there's actually a list of different communities and their status. So the city of Wickett in Ward County has a suspended status, and also the town of Valentine and Jeff Davis has a suspended status. You'll note here that the date of those is quite old. So it could be that these suspensions occurred a long time ago, and we may not know the exact circumstance of the suspensions, but it could be that there was not a need. The community did not see any need to continue participating in the NFIP program, and so just did not go through with that. So any questions on either of these two slides? There's a couple more question and answer slides after this. All right, so another question came up in our last subcommittee meeting about how can small communities, how can we assist small communities to enroll in the NFIP through funding, acknowledging that there can be an obstacle of funding and resources for these communities. As within the flood plan, the two FME is defined as a non-zero capital cost or other non-recurring cost. So in this instance, it would not fall under that because this is more of a recurring cost that would need to be factored into the community's ongoing operational costs. So in this case, it would fall under flood management strategy, which includes any proposed action that the RFPG would like to identify that does not qualify as either an FME or FMP. One example from the technical guidelines is a need for increased public awareness of flood risk. So similarly, if we identify this as a need, requesting funding for smaller communities to enroll in the NFIP, it can be included in the flood plan as an FMS, and that FMS can also have a cost associated with it. So that would be our proposed approach for incorporating something like this. And then lastly, this kind of ties into some of the discussions that we've had in our in 2 meetings ago, I believe, or in several of our subcommittee meetings regarding the county funding or county ability to regulate development and infrastructure. And so this was actually a question that we had to the subcommittee, in particular those who are familiar from the county perspective. If there's this was a proposition that was passed yesterday, actually, or Tuesday, in our state as a state proposition, and it authorizes counties to issue bonds for development of infrastructure projects. So we were curious to know if this was something that changes that the counties see as a benefit or may help. It doesn't address the regulation standpoint, but it may help identifying infrastructure projects or allocating funding for those. Is that, does anyone from our subcommittee have any comments on this? Okay.
Brian, I don't have any comment at this time. I haven't really had a chance to go over that.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. We just wanted to bring it up as a potential topic that may be relevant. We can continue investigating this, but the topic of regulation and legislative recommendations, those will come. Those will be carried over into our Task 8 review, which will have its own subcommittee. So our subcommittee today is still focused mainly on the standards and the goals, but we have talked a lot about county authority and county ability to influence projects and development. So just wanted to bring this up, and we can continue discussing that further. So, so these are slides kind of pertinent to the discussion on the recommendation of minimum standards, but I wanted to go back to the goals, because that's our primary focus here, and wanted to open up. We'll have some polls that are similar to what we discussed in our last meeting to to get initial to gauge initial interest, but I also wanted to, I guess, ask Dave if at this time you wanted to talk through the Region 15 list and see if there's any other goals that we wanted to add before we take a vote.
We had a little conversation before this meeting, but I assume that everybody here in the group has had a chance to look at the Region 15 goals. And I did an interesting crosswalk between our goals and the Region 15 goals. And with the added goals that Brian has given us today, every one of the blue items, with the exception of just one or two, is covered within one of our goals. I do find that in several circumstances, they have specified some interesting standards within those goals that are a little different than what we've chosen to do. And as we go through each goal here, I'll take the initiative to bring up that and see if we want to talk about it.
Okay, great. So I guess with that, do we just want to start from the top with the new goals and go through each one of these individually? So the first one was increasing the number of flood gauges, rainfall or stream gauges in the region.
Brian, let me ask you a question. We never ever got through 1 through 23 before. I'm wondering, remember we ran out of time in the other meeting? So do you plan on going back to them and addressing each of those? Or I know we did a poll on a couple of them, but I don't think we did polls on all of them, did we?
Oh, are you referring to these
original 1 through 19?
Okay. That's up to you all. We can, if desired. I think we didn't do a poll necessarily, but given the feedback that we received from our last meeting, we did receive some positive feedback just orally through our discussion. So
okay. All right. If we have time, we'll go back and review them then and put the percentages in. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So the main, I guess there's several questions with each of these goals. Is one of the questions is this a goal that we should consider including? And then the second question is what type of, if we do include it, what would be the time frame for the goal? Would it be a short-term 10-year goal or a long-term 30-year goal? So I posted a poll in our window here to see what everyone thinks on this particular goal. So we have and if Enrique, are you able to input your vote in the window? There's a submit vote option here.
Yeah, it didn't let me.
So does
oh, it didn't?
Vote or just he or I vote?
I'm sorry?
Who votes on this? Can we both vote on this one or either he or I?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably just you.
If I could put a vote in for either.
Okay, so it looks like we have pretty much a short-term, long-term interest in this particular goal. And we can refine what those might look like, what those targets might look like in our next subcommittee meeting. So then for the next question about increasing the number of entities that use flood warning signs. This may include traffic message boards to communicate flood warnings. And this would be, as reported, measured based on responses through the Stakeholder Survey. Okay, so again, it looks like short-term, long-term goal. For the person that put short-term goal, do we want to talk through, are there any concerns about setting a long-term goal or?
No, I just think it's something that could help right away.
Sure.
Yeah, sometimes there's no indication of any kind of flood in any kind of area at all. So I think that's something that could easily be put up right away and you'll see an effect right away.
Okay.
I agree with Javier completely, but the reason I selected short-term and long-term goal is because we don't have all the information we need for communities to tell us this is exactly where we think we need these communication. I need the other gauges as well. There's just the region's huge. I don't know the region myself personally, so I think we do need to make some long-term investments in figuring out where a lot of these communication signs are needed. That was my reasoning behind both.
Great. Okay. So I think we can include both short-term, long-term on that one as well. The next is increasing the number of entities that have a dedicated drainage fee. This was one of the goals that Region 15 had identified, and it could really help to improve access to funding sources for these projects. So I'm going to launch this poll here. Currently, the baseline of the percentage of respondents that indicated that they have one of these fees is 14%. When we looked at the survey.
What are you working on today?
We'll catch you up on the other stuff.
Tapping away over there.
Yeah, yeah. I'll tell you, man, this.
I have trouble using one of these. I'm so used to using this.
So it looks like that is also a short-term, long-term interest. Close that. And then the next one is develop and maintain community operational stormwater asset management plans. All right, so it looks like, again, we're going to have several short-term, long-term goals here. And then these next two pertain to other sources of funding, including decreasing the number of communities without a local funding source. So to encourage communities to at least have their own source, whether it's through a dedicated drainage fee or some other mechanism. So it seems like this is more of a short-term focus, but there's also a short-term, long-term split here. For those that answered short-term, are there any concerns with setting a long-term goal? Maybe is it too ambitious to set that long-term goal at this time and wait and see how the short-term goal pans out, or do we think that a long-term goal would be appropriate in this case?
Well, if I may, for those that selected long-term goal, would you be able to tell me what your reasoning behind the long-term goal was? Like, what do you envision as long-term strategies for this?
Well, I selected both only because I feel like we have to increase the number of funding sources, both short term. Obviously, it's important to do it as soon as possible, but you also want to keep increasing that number, I guess, is over the long term. That was my reasoning behind that.
I'd like to comment same. I agree with Sal. Gilbert, sorry.
So now let me ask you, we should increase the number of communities in the long run, but if we make that a short-term goal, we would be increasing it from the get-go, wouldn't we?
True, yeah. So without a defined target, the short-term and long-term goals are pretty much identical. But yeah, so maybe it makes sense from that perspective to just focus on short-term, and then maybe that goal can be redefined or recommitted in future cycles.
From my point of view, it's an extending process. It goes over a longer period of time than maybe we can define, and it's actually decreasing the number of communities without local funding. So as long as there is a community out there without local funding, it seems to me that this goal remains active.
Right.
That's why I put both.
The one thing we're not talking about here is quality. So, for example, one of my strategies would be to make sure that every county, every political subdivision contributes to the flood planning process the way most do in water planning. And so, I mean, what kind of funding, local funding, did you envision long term? Like, did you want them to hire somebody that's dedicated to that? I'm really struggling to understand that, like specific examples as to how this would work long term. Would you be able to just educate me in this? Like, what kinds of things do you have in mind?
Omar, the only thing I'm thinking is that as long as like I said, as long as there's a community out there without local funding source for flood management, then I think we should have some sort of an objective or goal to try to help them have that funding source. And I don't know what that source might be, but it just seems like where we can help them get a source, we should. I'm amenable to both. It doesn't really make any difference to me at this point, because like Brian said, we can always go back and adjust the goal later on if we have to. So I can go back to short term too. I'm not locked in.
And usually the local funding is probably some type of stormwater fee that everybody was gonna have to pay. So I think that's something that it's very needed. We all know the flooding needs of our cities, and we all know that those are expensive needs, and when the money's needed, you know, that the funds are needed. When we get flooded, and then of course the community wants response, right, from the representatives. But if there's no funding source set in place, then it's really hard to respond. That's why that's the reason why I'm thinking short, not short, long. That way we get everybody started. I mean, we're doing this, we're doing this process so that we can all be protected, right? So that's the reason why I feel that this should be a short-term goal and not a short, long. That way everybody jumps on the horse in the beginning.
I do think that we should put a lot of effort into getting some all of these communities into paying allocating local funding to flood management. And the way I see it, for example, the city of El Paso and El Paso County already dedicate a whole bunch of money through different ways. County specifically does general fund. City of El Paso has other options, but these smaller communities and counties beyond El Paso County, the only option I really see very viable for them will be either through some sort of bond program in partnership with the Texas Water Development Board, where they, paid for they're paying back a loan, or contributing a small portion of their general funds, which are already very limited anyway. But I don't see them ever, and I mean, somebody might have a different opinion, but I don't see them ever really like collecting a major stormwater utility fee and things like that. I mean, other than Pecos, I can't really think of any other community that would really go for something like that. But again,
but yeah, not a major utility fee, but because even if you do bonds or loans, you have to pay them back. You have to pay them back, so there has to be some type of fee. Maybe not a major one like you're saying, but some type of fee. I mean, and that way we can, the protection can be there somehow. I'm not saying that they're gonna be, if something happens, that there's gonna be all this money to be able to do everything that's needed, because that's not the case. The need is always greater than the funds, always. So, but there needs to be something in place, and that's something that I too feel like we need to pay special attention to, so that we can get that going from the beginning. That's just my 2 cents.
So I wanted to point out, this is the survey question that we asked, and the different responses, choices that the respondents had to select from, and so here is there were 6 respondents that said we do not have a local funding source. So the target would be to get this number down to 0 if possible, in the long term. But I agree from a goal setting perspective, especially since there's not a specific target. It may make sense to just focus on the short term for now, just to get everyone engaged, and then recommit to it later. Another example of this type of goal that we've already discussed is increasing the number of communities enrolled in the CRS program. We don't have a long-term goal on that one. Same with communities who have adopted higher than Nfip minimum standards. That was specifically a short-term goal, with the idea that the short-term goal would be important to commit the region to that goal, to get engagement and enough to set a target for future long-term goals. So I don't know if that helps at all. Do we want to revote on this, or does anyone have this?
I'm okay with either option.
Can 24 fall under 25? Can those two be consolidated?
Do seem,
easily? Because really what we're talking about here
Yeah.
is increasing resources for people rather than decreasing the number of communities that have no local funding source. So
sure.
if we just say that's part of 25, it seems logical to me to be able to do that.
Yeah, they are very similar. I think the idea of increasing the sources was just to sort of increase the total responses in each of these categories, whereas the decreasing those without local funding source was kind of focused more specifically on this, getting this number down to 0. Because
Why
some
can't we
communities
say increase the number of resources used to pay for implementation of flood management objectives in order to decrease the number of communities without local
Yeah.
funding sources?
Sure.
And just combine the two. Does that sound reasonable? We already voted on it, I know, but does that sound reasonable to everybody?
Yes.
Yes, it sounds reasonable to me.
Val, you were one of the ones that went long-term, you agree?
Hey, Dave, I believe you're talking to me, right, Gilbert?
Or Gilbert, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Because I've done that twice.
Yeah, because I guess we both had the same hair, our same barber, I guess, and
Yeah.
and the goatee or something. That's probably what it is.
Yeah. Can you go along?
But no, I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem with going short term at all. Obviously, I think that's what's important. I just like I said, my interpretation of it was being that that we were decreasing the communities, and I thought eventually if we decrease them all at once at the short term, then obviously there's no need for a long term. But I have no problem with going short term.
Okay, Gilbert. The question I was wanting today, is it okay to roll 24 into 25?
Oh, yes. No, not a problem. I think it's fine.
Okay, just get rid of 24 and just use 25.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Do we want to vote on this, or I think we got consensus there on
Sure.
this item here? 25. Yes. Okay. And that will be, did we decide a short-term focus for now and then would be reevaluated?
On 24?
Yes, on 24.
My thought was just get rid of 24 and roll it into 25.
Or, sorry, on 25.
I think that's a short-term focus, 25, which includes 24 as part of it.
Okay. So we'll focus on the short-term target for this to increase the number of sources and decrease the number of communities without a local funding source.
And do it short term.
Yes.
Okay. Do we need to have a poll on that one?
Okay, sure.
I mean, it's up to you. I think seems like everybody agrees.
Yeah, I think so too. But if anyone objects, I guess let us know. Okay, so hearing none. Does anyone have any other goals to add to the list that we haven't yet discussed? Or Dave, are there any others from the Region 15 outline that you would like to discuss?
There are a couple of entries on there that we didn't cover on our goals, and one of them was under flood warning and readiness. Increase the number of entities that use TV, radio, social media, and billboards to communicate flood warnings. We didn't really put that specifically anywhere, although it could be, I think, rolled under something. Let me check to see if there's any others.
So yeah, we have a variation of that with a number of entities that use flood warning signs and traffic message boards. So if you want to, we can also add the TV, radio, social media component to that goal.
Okay, that sounds reasonable. And there was another one that said increase the number of entities that provide regional detention as a part of their floodplain management program. I don't think we talked anywhere about adding detention ponds or detention areas as an objective. And then there was another one, establish regional storage facilities that could be used dually for water supply. And I think we've got an area in El Paso that we're already working on to do that. So through flood management, through water planning. I think we did a pretty good job of overlapping. I was quite surprised when I did the crosswalk that we came up with very, very similar. We stayed them a little differently than they did, but they're very similar.
Great. Do you want to have a poll on each of these that you just mentioned, or how would you like to? Do you want to? I can add them to this list here, and we can.
Is there anybody that objects to letting Brian simply integrate those thoughts into some of the goals as he sees appropriate? No objections?
No
No
objection.
objection.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll do that then. Assuming we're going to meet next Thursday briefly, I can incorporate those changes in our next week's meeting. That works. Or
is it scheduled to be an hour or how long?
It was just an hour, but we may not need the whole time.
No, I'm questioning about the length of time on this one. If we have time, was this scheduled to be an hour?
This one was an hour and a half. We have 30 minutes.
Okay, do you want to go back and look at individual goals then and see if we can kill some of those yellow zones and then not have to do anything next time? Or do you think we still need to?
We also need to talk through
next time?
We do also need to talk through the minimum standards question. So I think it may be better to shift gears briefly and talk about that, and then if we have time, we can come back and maybe revisit those 3 goals and the yellow highlighted.
It's all right. I'm okay with the next meeting. I go ahead and go into your minimum standards.
Okay. All right. So this is a continuation of the discussion of whether the region would like to recommend minimum standards or adopt minimum standards. And again, the difference there being if the region adopts minimum standards, they would then be, communities would then need to meet those minimum standards in order to include their FMEs, FMSs, and FMPs in the flood plan. So that's the reason why I mentioned earlier, kind of that's tied in with the timeline, the length of time required for the community to enroll in the Nfip, and the concerns that were brought up previously on doing that. So I guess first off, maybe there's already consensus here, but I wanted to just ask this again. Should the RFPG require and adopt region-specific minimum standards? So that's posted in the chat.
Brian, I guess what I need to know, I put yes, but I need to know what are the adverse effects of requiring minimum standards again, instead of just recommending them?
Sure. So I think I haven't yet discussed these slides, which may be helpful. And so the adverse effects of that would be the communities, like whatever those standards might be, if communities do not currently meet those standards, then they would not be able to include their FMEs, FMSs, and FMPs in the flood plan in this first cycle. They could make those changes by the next cycle, and that would make them eligible to participate But at least under our interpretation, if the standards were adopted by the RFPG, those the communities that do not meet those standards would then not be able to include those FMEs, FMSs, and FMPs. So with that in mind, I wanted to get a little bit more into the stakeholder survey. I know last meeting we looked at the answers, and a lot of respondents said yes, the region should require these standards. And then a question came up, well, who is responding to this question? And there were 2 entities that responded as yes, that the region should require these standards who do not participate in the NFIP. Now, to be fair, the survey didn't specifically state, what the implications would be of the RFPG requiring these standards. It didn't specifically define the standards. So I'm not sure how helpful this particular slide is for, understanding, the intent or wishes of the individual stakeholders. But the NFIP standards were kind of suggested as a possible standard that could be adopted for by the RFPGs, as a base level minimum set of standards. And so that was kind of what we discussed in a previous meeting, but we hadn't really landed on a consensus yet. So some of the, if you look at the standards or activities in terms of their from least restrictive to most restrictive, you could start with NFIP requirements, like selecting different requirements from those minimum standards. We've kind of broadly summarized those here. If a community were to adopt all of those, they would be eligible to participate in the NFIP. Then for those that are participating in the NFIP, you can adopt higher than NFIP minimum standards. And then those higher standards then make you eligible for enrollment in the CRS rating program. So this is kind of the threshold or range of least restrictive to most restrictive standards. And we definitely, as RFPG would need to determine if adopting standards, where along the spectrum would you want to draw that line?
Brian, I was just going to ask, couldn't we just make it not required during the first year, and then maybe after the second year or something like that?
Yes. So I think I see Richard shaking or nodding his head. So what the guidance that we've received from other regions is that they are recommending standards now, and those would not be tied in any way restricting any entities in participating in this first cycle. Those recommendations could then be applied later on in future cycles, or considered again to kind of as that adopted standard that we've discussed. So that would be the recommendation that would fall under potential recommendations for standards, and there would not be any adverse effects of any of the entities at this time if you were to recommend standards.
Just to comment, I went back and looked at your percentage of respondents answering yes, and out of the 31 total, actually there were 5 out of 31 that didn't respond at all. So of those people that responded, it's actually about 85% of those said yes. I guess I ultimately do agree with the recommendation early and requirement later. I think that's a good idea, but I find it interesting that 85% of the respondents actually supported a yes answer for requirement. So it sounds to me like there are an awful lot of communities out there that are prepared to comply right off the bat. But I do like the idea of delaying it. I think that's a good idea.
So that's definitely the safest approach at this time. I just want to ask though, the poll seems to suggest otherwise right now. So
Do another poll, Brian.
okay.
So we've got documentation of the adjustment. I think your explanation helped a lot.
Okay.
And Gilbert's comment. And some nods from Texas Water Development Board.
I can't, the TWDB does not have an official position, but other region, we haven't seen a region adopt any standards yet. Many of them have just been recommending with the intent to, in later cycles, adopt them.
Good clarification. Political purposes, right?
Sorry, I'm just typing it up really quick. All right, so this is going to be our official recommendation vote by the subcommittee. And by later adopt, I mean in future planning cycles. Okay, so I think we've got consensus there. So with that in mind, this question is intended to better define what standards should the RPG recommend. So now we're getting in more into specifics of like, what would those recommendations look like, knowing that they're not going to negatively impact any communities, but these, and again, there could be more other standards that you want to recommend that are not on this list, and feel free to mention or just, you can check. This is a multi, you can actually select multiple options on this one. So this goes to the question, or this actually goes back to the slide of what the potential range of standards might look like. So I guess question for Richard actually, is the intent for these recommendations would, if the region does not choose to adopt and they choose to recommend instead, is the intent that these recommendations would then be adopted, or are there other recommendations that could be added in that are not relevant to any future adoption? There's just kind of recommendations in general.
They can be recommendations in general.
Okay.
The intent is for, at a federal level, the NFIP standards are like the go-to resource of what communities should adopt. Now, you guys at a regional scale, if there are specific NFIP requirements that you think in your region need to be bumped up, I identify those. Or if there are requirements outside of NFIP that need to be recognized and recommended to your specific communities, kind of pull those out. Okay. And it's supposed to be a region-specific resource for you to show your community saying, hey, if you want to do something, look at this list and see what you can do.
Got it. Okay. Are communities at this stage or other regions signaling to entities that these may be adopted later? for, in future cycles, to kind of let them know that they may need to implement some of these to include their FMSs and FMEs and all that?
Yes. So far, I mean, both my other regions, Region 3 Trinity Basin, which includes just Dallas-Fort Worth, and my NACHIS region, which is like Beaumont area. Both of those regions have signaled that, like, hey, we are just recommending this cycle, but prepare to be, in the future, for these to be adopted to
Sure.
be able to submit projects to the plan.
Okay. So I guess with that in mind, it sounds like some recommendations could be made with that feature adoption in mind, and some recommendations could just be in addition to those future adoption items. We do have a majority of respondents agreeing that the participating in the NFIP does make sense as a recommendation. We also got a few responses regarding the higher standards, that those could be recommendations as well. Does anyone feel that anything that we should be signaling to the region that any of these items should be that may be adopted in later cycles as a requirement? And by later cycles, we're referring to years in the future. This cycle will end in 2023, 2024, I believe. And the second cycle will begin after that. So,
just my opinion, Brian, but I think the NFIP standards is a very good starting point. And in the future cycles, definitely try and get some of those. Once the communities get familiar with the standards, at that point, try and implement the higher standards and possibly the CRS for those communities.
Great, yeah.
Yeah, I think we also need to pay attention to what the financial burden might be on any given community to accomplish what they need to accomplish too, and how we might be able to help with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it sounds like the NFIP may be a good benchmark for future adoption, but for now, the recommendations may include more general things like this: participating in the NFIP, adoption of higher standards, enrollment in the CRS program. We can also try to make more general recommendations that are region specific. Let me close this poll. Unless, does anyone else have any input on this, on the replies here?
Let me just add to
Yeah.
what Javier just mentioned. I think I guess what I envisioned is obviously recommending really the higher of whatever the community can accomplish, but I'm envisioning maybe the participation in NFIP as the minimum for year cycle, I guess the second year cycle, and then much longer terms, like Javier said, obviously increase the standard in much further in the future.
Okay. Let me ask, do you think it would be beneficial? You can feel free to, this is kind of a more detailed question that kind of unpacks the NFIP minimum standards. Are there any particular items within this that we want to emphasize for our region, kind of to Richard's point about making this more region specific? These are some of the, if we were to focus in on the minimum standards within the NFIP that apply to those communities that do not participate in our region, These would be the 4 items. So maybe just see, so the first one is reviewing development permits and proposals for flood risk. The next is establishing flood resiliency measures for water supply and sanitary sewage systems. And these, if you would like to, as an additional resource, you can also refer to one of our previous meetings from October 21st, where we defined each of the NFIP standards in detail. That was here. So this was the full kind of list of all of the NFIP standards for for areas where there's no FEMA defined flood zone. So the first one in that poll has to do with development permits and proposals, which includes all of these 4. The second is flood resiliency for water supply and sanitary sewage systems, which includes, design measures to make sure that they're not within the flood zone, they're not going to be contaminated. That's for water and wastewater. And then for areas within Zone A, there are additional requirements related to utilizing BFE and flood proofing information and water course alteration relocation. So just wanted to see if anyone has any specific interests or things that we want to focus in particular to emphasize in our recommendations. The recommendations would still include participating in the NFIP, but wanted to see if anyone has any specific region-wide or region-specific recommendations that they want to add, either these or any others.
Brian, did you say that the first one includes all 4?
The first, so this includes these are not listed out specifically in the poll, but they can be summarized as requiring development permits and proposals for reviewing flood safety or flood risk. And then the second one is the poll is kind of focusing on these higher level bullet points. This here and then this, because this one's kind of the same as this one on this slide, but it's more tailored to flood zones in Zone A. And then the water course alteration relocation is this item here. But it sounds like the recommendations could really be anything. So we're just suggesting ideas at this point. Since we're not necessarily tying it to the flood plan, we're just making recommendations to the region. So if you see anything that you would like to add or emphasize, that's not on this list, we can also talk through that. And maybe if there's anything we can look into by next week, to investigate further, we can also talk through that. Okay, so it seems like the first 2 are definitely, there's a consensus there, and that makes sense because those are the, in terms of the bare minimum a community would need to do to meet those minimum standards. These items kind of fall within that. And these would apply to any community regardless of whether the community is mapped or whether the community does not have a flood zone. And these are a little bit more stringent and would apply to communities with flood zone A, but these would be kind of applied to all communities in the country, regardless of their location. So we could emphasize these in our recommendations and also just include a statement about participation in the NFIP. Beyond these items, are there any others that you would like us to address in our recommendations to the region? All right, hearing none, we can we'll draft something up so we can review it in more detail in our next subcommittee meeting next week, and it will serve as that will be like the language that we post to the public for the voting on November 30th by the RFPG. So I think there will still be an opportunity next week if you want to think about potential recommendations and add any other items. Just bring those to our next meeting and we can talk through those then. But I think I would like to just clarify though that they are different from the goals in that I think the intent is that the recommendations are things that the RPG wants to emphasize as important now, like today, for communities to think about, whereas goals have a longer term focus, even the short term ones. I mean, there may be some overlaps between the standards or the recommendations and the goals. The recommendations would apply as of November 30th. These are the things that communities need to start doing, and now to improve their flood resiliency. All right, so I think that covers all of the slides. Were there any other questions or items that we wanted to discuss? Seems like we've covered everything, so.
I just had a net check to see if there are any guests out there that might want to comment, but there aren't any.
If I can just verify, Carlos, you are here as well, right?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, thank you.
Are we all through, Brian?
Yes, we're done.
Do we need a time to adjourn?
Sure. Yeah.
So before we do that, just as a reminder, the next meeting has been set for
The 11th
for
at 3 o'clock.
November 11th at 3 o'clock.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone. So we'll have to, on Monday, you'll be getting an email reminder with the link to the agenda that has the backup materials. Okay, thank you.
And Brian, you'll have things updated for that distribution?
Yes.
Okay, great. Can we get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Move to adjourn.
Omar.
Second.
Thanks.
Ooh, yeah, a lot. Okay.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Passes. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a good day, everybody.
Yeah,
Bye. Bye.